Hey guys, I just went ahead and fully completed the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, DLC, whatever the hell you want to call it. I fought every single boss. I made sure to check with an interactive map and everything. I fought every single boss. I did almost all of the side stuff. Unfortunately, not all the side quests. And it took me about 30 hours. Now that is with 4 hours exclusively trying to beat the final boss, but I finally managed to take him down. My total death count for the entirety of the game was 137 deaths, so definitely quite a lot, but not as bad as a lot of other people out there. I've seen a lot of people out there dying 100 times to a regular, just a single boss. So I fared a little bit better than everybody else, but of course I was using, summons, and I was using every single tool at my disposal. So let me go ahead and give you the pros, the cons, and my final verdict of the expansion. Normally I don't really review DLCs, but I think this one is a bit of an exception, right? Because I think we've all been waiting for this one. The first pro is that I really like a lot of the new items that they've added. Like, the new weapons are all very, very cool. The perfume bottles and the martial arts and the beast claws, all of that stuff is very cool. And even just the additions to normal weapons that they have, they have very interesting passive effects on them. In the base game, you'll get the raptor talons or something, right? And it has a passive of jump attacks do extra damage. And that's kind of boring, right? But in this, in the DLC, for example, I got a hammer, and it made it so if I imbue it with sacred, if I give it holy damage, it'll actually get multiplicative more amounts of holy damage. So it's encouraging you to imbue it with holy. And then on top of that, it had a unique effect where if you use a guard counter, it does a special move. See, that's really interesting. That's far more interesting, in my opinion, than 8% extra jump attack damage or something like that. And there's actually several weapons in the DLC that do stuff like that. There's a katana that makes it so you have almost maximum poise. You cannot be staggered while you're attacking, but you take extra damage when you're attacking. So there's a lot of stuff like that, and I find that really interesting, and it does lead to you wanting to check all of the gear that you find, as well as a lot of the armor sets. Drippy as all hell, dude. Absolutely drip-tastic. So yeah, I really like a lot of the new items that are added. I also do think that a lot of the boss fights are really good. They have some issues, which I'll talk about in the cons, but for the most part, I really like a lot of the boss fights in the game. I also just think visually it's stunning. Elden Ring is kind of the perfect case for why graphical fidelity and textures and stuff like that ultimately don't matter if you have great art design. This game, yeah, if you zoom in on any of the textures, it looks like hot garbage, right? It looks very dated. You zoom in on any of the faces or anything, it looks like trash. But when you're looking at the vistas, you're looking at the Erdtree and the shadows wrapped around this castle, and you're looking at, just this, there's this one place called the Cerulean Coast, and it's just gorgeous, dude. It's just blue everywhere. There's all these little wisps. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And it's a pleasure to look at a lot of the time. I wish it was a pleasure to look at the performance, but we'll touch on that in the cons as well. But the art design here is fantastic. And also, I really like the story, which is kind of a weird thing to talk about. I know a lot of people don't pay attention to it, but if you're really paying attention to the characters' quests and stuff like that, then it's really cool to actually see, a character like Mesmer or Mikola, right? After you've heard so much about them and not seen them in the base game, it's really neat to actually see them in the flesh. And there are definitely some really cool surprises as well. I also think the sound design here and the music is obviously A1. I mean, it's always been A1. Let's all be honest with each other. FromSoft always hits it out of the park. Hell, even Dark Souls 2 has a banger soundtrack, and that game's dookie. Uh, but I think the soundtrack and everything is really, really good in this game. But let's get into the negative. Because there's quite a few, and the reviews are very mixed, and in my opinion, for good reason. First things first, let's talk about the difficulty. The difficulty is obscene in this DLC. It is insane from a scaling perspective. When you first get into the DLC and you don't have any of the Erdtree blessings, which these blessings are things that you can find Erdtree fragments and think of them as like golden seeds, right? You get these golden seeds as you play through normal Elden Ring, and that allows you to strengthen your flask, give it more uses. Think of it, the Erdtree blessing says that you're getting these fragments, and every time you get a few, it allows you to upgrade at a bonfire. But you're not upgrading your flask, you're upgrading yourself, and each upgrade gives you approximately 5% extra damage and 8% more protections. And you can see how this can ramp up rather quickly once you start accumulating a lot of these Erdtree blessings. And so their way of kind of balancing the DLC is when you first get in, everything is insane. A dog will 1 or 2 shot you, right? And you'll see that from the reviews. It's just regular enemies tossing rocks will do 20% of your health, right? And I'm not talking a little bit of health. I'm talking, both of my characters, I went in with 60 vigor, heavy armor, right? Defensive talismans as well. And you're still going to be taking like 20% of your health just from a rock. But as you accumulate these Erdtree blessings, things get more and more approachable. And some people are going to like that, and some people are going to hate that. And you're seeing that in the reviews. For me, personally, I am not the biggest fan of the system. And the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of the system is because it ultimately causes every single build to feel very similar at the beginning of the game, of the DLC, because every single build is going to want that 60 vigor, every single build is going to want those defensive talismans, and every single build is going to want to run heavy armor. And for me personally, I just think that's not very healthy for the game. Yes, as you accumulate Erdtree blessings, you are indeed able to kind of branch out and use different gear. But for a while, you are pigeonholed into being essentially the same as everybody else, or you're essentially just doing a no-hit run, right? And it's like, whenever you bring up any complaint in the FromSoft community, not all of them, but there is this subset of turbo virgins where, they say, oh, just get good or skill issue. And I think in general, that's very unhealthy. It's healthy to actually have intellectual discourse and to raise valid complaints about a game, especially if you feel that the scaling is too high or too low. That's 100% fair to do, and it's not really a get good type of thing, because yes, ultimately somebody will beat every single FromSoft game, with the Dance Dance Revolution pad, blindfolded, level 1, only using their bare fists or whatever, right? Yes, somebody's going to do that. But should the game be balanced around this 0.001% of God gamers? I would say no. I'd say that's very unhealthy to do. And, me coming from like a competitive shooter background, I think it's always been terrible when games have been balanced around the top 0.01%, right? It's been terrible for everybody else. And I think this is a situation where I do think the difficulty needs to be nerfed a little bit. I think, like, if you were to make it so just default you start the DLC at like a Erdtree 3 blessing, or maybe even 4, I think that would make it feel a lot healthier going into it, because it feels like you go from being a god to just being absolute trash, in the DLC. And I don't think that feels very good. I don't think that there needs to be a nerf for really any movesets or anything like that, except the final boss, which I'll talk about a little bit very vaguely. But overall, I do think there should be a little bit of a nerf just on the normal enemies and on the scaling. but I think all of the moves and stuff like that are completely fine. Like I said, I beat the game with 137 deaths. That's significantly less than every single other person that I've seen. Yes, a lot of the big streamers and stuff aren't using summons, which is totally fine. However, it's not as if, you know, I was getting rolled in the DLC or anything like that. I just, you know, I didn't personally struggle a lot. I went into that final boss, you know, and I had fought every other boss in the entire game, and I was at like 70 deaths. So obviously I wasn't struggling that much, but I do think the scaling is a little bit out of whack. I don't think with 60 vigor, you know, Morgoth's rune increasing your health by 50%, 4 defensive talismans, heavy armor, you should still be losing half of your health because you got stabbed by 1 mesmer soldier. You know, it's a little bit silly at that point. The performance is also trash. It's trash. Here's the thing. Elden Ring performance has always been trash. You can go look at Digital Foundry's video on it, literally day one when the game came out, and it had severe CPU stuttering. And that is still here in full force. It's still here in the base game. So of course it's going to be here in the DLC. However, when you get, in particular, if you're doing there's one section of the game where you're doing a dragon fight, and the dragon is fighting a group of dudes, and he's sending out fire, and there's all these sparks and stuff. The frame rate dropped significantly, and it was like that a lot of the time in the open world fights, is that the frame rate would just tank unexpectedly. And I have a beast of a rig. I have like a top 1 to 5% PC. I have a 4070 Ti Super, 64 gigabytes of DDR5, 6000 megahertz RAM, and a Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. And the game is on an NVMe SSD. You know, it's a very powerful rig, top of the line, and I'm only playing at 1440p with no ray tracing. So I don't really think dropping below 60 FPS should ever be a thing. And my cousin, he has a worse rig than mine, and he said it was dropping the same way even at 1080p. And if you look at the reviews, a lot of people are having these issues, so it most definitely needs to be addressed. I also think that the DLC suffers from something I thought in the base game as well, which is a lot of the time when you're fighting these bosses or these larger enemies in the open world, the terrain can really cause them to bug out. And this is especially evident with this new enemy. You probably saw it at the beginning of the gameplay here. I call them the Wicker Mans. They're these giant like wick baskets full of fire. Furnace goblins, I think they're called, or golems or something like that. And these are enemies that you fight in the open world, and they will give you sacred deers when you beat them. So they're kind of like the Erdtree avatars, you know, from the base game. But these guys are not fun to fight. They're not particularly challenging to fight, but they're just very, very annoying to fight. And it's because they do these stomp attacks where they stomp and it sends out a thing of flame, and then you can just jump over the flame. However, because it's in the open world and the terrain is so fucked up, a lot of the times if they're on higher ground than you and they stomp, that flame glitches out and it no longer just travels down the terrain like you would think it should. It will hover above the ground because they did it when they're on higher ground. And that causes you to get hit even when you jump. And that was extremely frustrating. On top of that, you know, a couple of the dragon fights, you have the dragon like up on a rock, glitching out, you know, shooting fire and just kind of getting fucked on around there. Or you have like an enemy stagger and they're on a rock. And so now you can't get the, you know, the visceral attack because they're up on a rock, you know. The normal game of Elden Ring suffers with this. It's just part of, you know, not having a meticulously crafted arena for the boss fight. But this DLC definitely struggles in that regard as well. And there's, especially when you're fighting those Wicker Men, it gets fucking annoying, for sure. One other negative I will say is regarding the final boss. The final boss is horseshit. If you look him up, you'll see, I'm not going to spoil anything, but whenever there's a boss and the only information you can find is how do I cheese this boss, You know the dude's fucking hard. This boss is insanely hard. I've played every single FromSoft game. I've well over 1,000 hours in all of their, series. I've played the DLCs as well. Other than Dark Souls 3 DLC, I haven't played Dark Souls 3 DLC, but, I've played like Bloodborne DLC and stuff like that. And I gotta say, this is the hardest boss they've ever made. Pretty hands down. And this could be the hardest boss I've ever fought in a video game. It is absurdly difficult. The amount of moves, how aggressive this enemy is, how much ground they cover with AoE, and then the number one problem I have, and this applies to a lot of the fights, not just this final fight, but it is very bad in this final fight, is you're not only fighting the boss, you're fighting the camera as well. You're fighting the fucking camera because especially when you lock on, you're locked onto like center mass, and a lot of these enemies are larger, so your camera's already down a little bit below your back. And especially with the final boss, they do attacks that cause a lot of visual clutter in between the camera and your character. So the visual clutter is just right up in front of the screen, and it makes it a lot of the time you cannot see fucking anything. And this is very frustrating. This also happens in like the dancing lion fight, which that's not a spoiler because it's been in the trailers. I've seen a lot of complaints about the dancing lion fight as well. If you're trying to melee and you're doing it, it's really annoying because you're like locked on, and then if the dancing lion, for example, moves up, your camera is then like zooming into your character's like, the middle of their back, their scapulas, practically the back of their head. And it makes it very, very frustrating when you're trying to, read what the enemy's doing. Eventually, after you've done enough attempts on a boss, I'm sure you learn their move set and you kind of just figure out what they're doing even before you see them do it, really. But this is something that should be mentioned, is the camera can be very frustrating to deal with. Overall, though, I think that this DLC is definitely one of From Software's best. It has all of that sense of grandeur. It has all of that exploration fun that the base game had, and it has a lot of content. I know some people have been upset that it's $40, but it is $40 for, in my case, 30 hours of content, 25 hours of content if you don't want to count the last 5 hours dying to the final boss. So it does have a lot of content. And then on top of that, I instantly did want to go through and do another playthrough as a different build so I could try some other stuff out. So overall, I'd say it's definitely worth if you're a big Elden Ring fan. But I think with this, like most games these days, honestly, I think you're probably better off waiting for a few patches, possibly for things to be nerfed. Who knows if things will be nerfed? But definitely for some of the performance issues to be ironed out, and hopefully some of the camera issues to be ironed out. And then I think, this will most definitely be worth picking up. But overall, I did enjoy my time with it. I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. For me, 5 is average, 6 is above average, 7 is good. I think Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is a good time. I do think it definitely has issues with the scaling being a little bit out of whack before you get all of the scad tree, fragments, and definitely some issues with the camera, with the open world bosses bugging the hell out, and especially with performance. But I am hopeful that a lot of that stuff is going to be remedied, and I do think ultimately it is worth picking up if you're a fan of Elden Ring, and it will give you quite a few hours of enjoyment. So anyway, let me know what you guys thought. Do you completely disagree? Are you one of the people that just loves to say, get good, skill issue, whenever anybody has any sort of complaint? If so, I despise you with a passion, and I will delete your comments and ban you because I just fucking hate people that do that. Or are you, somebody that is a fan of the DLC? Maybe you actually have intellectual, retorts or rebuttals as to things that I'm incorrect about. I would love to hear it. But yeah, have a great rest of your day, guys, and I'll see all of you in the next video or stream. Bye-bye.